All right. Ready to dive into some, well, unorthodox territory today.
Yeah.
Curtis Yarvin.
Oh, boy.
Have you read much of Yarvin?
I have. I've dipped in. He's a thinker who generates a lot of debate.
That's one way to put it.
To put it mildly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We're looking at his essay, #5, The Land, Its People, and Their Dogs.
Okay.
Which reads like, I don't know, a blueprint for like a total societal reboot.
Yeah, reboot is the right word. And he doesn't just critique our current systems. He really tries to build an entirely new framework from the ground up.
Yeah, it's not, here's what's wrong with everything.
Right.
Like, here's what's wrong with everything, and here's a totally different way to think about the world.
Here's how we could do it differently.
And to do that, he creates this fictional nation, Colombia, which I guess we're supposed to imagine is like a parallel universe US or something, in order to like really go full bore on these ideas.
It's a thought experiment in absolute public policy, right? Like imagining a nihilist prince who can just reshape society without constraint.
With no opposition.
Right.
Yeah, like assume a can opener.
Yeah. Yeah.
But for like a dictator, basically.
Yeah, yeah.
So we're diving into a world of what ifs here.
Sure.
And I think it's fair to say that some of Yarvin's proposals are gonna raise some eyebrows, maybe cause a little bit of indigestion.
Sure.
But I think the goal here, at least for this deep dive, is not necessarily to say, yes, this is good or this is bad, but just to really try to like understand the core of his argument.
I think that's fair.
And maybe steelman it a little bit, right? Like, what is he getting at, even if the way he's getting at it is a little
Totally. I think that's the most charitable way to approach someone like Yarvin, where you know going in that you're going to be...
He's going to say some stuff.
He's going to say some spicy stuff.
And so the goal here is not to just like get offended by it.
Right.
Right. But to say like, okay, well, if we take this really wild idea seriously for a minute, like, where does it lead? What is he even saying?
Yeah, I think that's right. And that's where it gets interesting because, you know, Yarvin's central thesis, the foundation of his argument, is that the whole foundation of liberal economics, right, this idea of maximizing things like GDP, has fundamentally failed us.
Okay.
So he has this term that he uses, diseconomics, which, you know...
Which sounds ominous.
It sounds ominous, right?
Yeah.
And he's talking about this idea of intentional disutility, this idea that strategically making production more difficult could actually lead to greater human fulfillment. Now, that...
Wait, hold on.
Yeah.
Back up. He wants to make production more difficult.
That's the idea.
Like we don't have enough supply chain problems already.
Right.
He wants to intentionally make things harder to make.
That's the core of the argument.
Okay, I already need to like buckle my seatbelt here because that just strikes me as so counterintuitive.
Yeah, it really cuts against how we typically think about progress and efficiency.
Right, because we're always told like, oh, we've got to be more efficient, got to make things, faster, cheaper, better.
Right, and he's saying, well, what if instead of easier, we made it a little bit harder? What would that do to us as individuals and as a society? And to illustrate this point, he uses this really interesting analogy from the world of physics called the ultraviolet catastrophe.
The ultraviolet catastrophe. That sounds pretty bad.
Yeah, it's this prediction in classical physics that everything in the universe should be radiating infinite energy.
Which obviously is not happening.
Yeah, we'd all be fried if that were true. And it was this kind of clue, right? This sign that something in our initial assumptions about how the universe worked was wrong, right? And the solution to this in physics was quantum mechanics, which completely changed our understanding of the universe at a fundamental level. And so Yarvin's argument is that economics needs a similar paradigm shift.
So he's saying that our pursuit of constant optimization in economics, in markets, right? Like always striving for more, faster, cheaper, that might actually be blinding us to a different kind of progress. One that focuses more on human meaning and less on just material wealth.
Precisely. And this leads us to another key concept in Yarvin's framework, which is his classification of society into 3 distinct groups.
Okay.
The armigers, the yeomen, and the lazari.
All armigers, yeomen, and lazari. It kind of sounds like something out of, I don't know.
It sounds very medieval, doesn't it?
Yeah, like a medieval feudal system. Like, okay,
Right.
where's the dragon in this analogy?
Right.
But I think he's tapping into something kind of profound about human nature, right? Like how different groups of people find meaning and purpose in very different ways.
Right, and it's not just medieval, is it? You think about, Plato's Republic with its philosopher kings and warrior class. These are ancient ideas about social order, and he's sort of giving them this modern twist.
Okay, so that's where the real meat of his argument lies.
Yeah.
It's not just about classifying people. It's about understanding what makes each of these groups tick.
Right.
And how they can contribute to a well-functioning society.
Exactly.
So let's maybe unpack these groups a bit. Who are the armigers in Yarvin's world?
They're in many ways, they kind of resemble what we might call the meritocratic elite today.
Yeah.
They're driven by achievement, knowledge, self-actualization. Think academics, artists, entrepreneurs.
The people who are supposed to be like the best and brightest in our current system.
Exactly.
Right.
The folks who thrive in a world of ideas and innovation.
Yeah, but Yarvin sees a potential dark side to this group as well, right?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
He argues that this pursuit of self-actualization can very easily morph into a thirst for status and power.
Yeah.
Which, in his view, completely disqualifies them from holding any real political authority.
Interesting.
It's a pretty scathing critique of the intellectual class.
It's funny because, like, on the one hand, he's saying, like, these are the people who are in some ways like the most capable, right?
Yeah, the most potential.
Yeah, they have the most potential. They have the most ability.
Right.
But then on the other hand, he's saying, like, they're also the least trustworthy.
They're the least trustworthy, yeah.
With power.
Because that very drive, that ambition can be turned to ill ends very, very easily.
So if the armigers aren't fit to rule, who is?
Right.
And that's where the yeomen come in, right?
That's right.
So tell me more about the yeomen.
Yeah.
Because they're a little bit, I don't know, they're a little bit harder for me to wrap my head around.
So the yeomen think of them as the bedrock of society.
Right.
Right. The folks who find meaning in tradition and family, community, craft.
They're not driven by the same kind of like individualistic impulses as the armigers.
They're not trying to like climb Maslow's hierarchy.
Right.
They are more about stability hierarchy.
They want a sense of belonging.
A longing, exactly.
They want to know their place in the world.
Exactly.
Which is kind of interesting because in our modern world, we often see that as a bad thing.
Right. It's like it's seen as backwards,
right,
to not want to constantly be
and not be climbing, to not be like self-actualizing or whatever.
Yeah.
But
Yarvin's saying like, no, actually, those are the people who keep the lights on. Those are the people who,
they're the farmers, the artisans.
They're exactly
small business owners.
Yeah, the people who build strong local communities.
And in his ideal world, they would have a significant degree of autonomy, right?
That's like governing themselves.
Yeah, they're not answering to
like traditional structures and customs.
Right, like the federal government in Washington, D.C.
Yeah.
They're doing their own thing.
It's a very localized vision, right?
Very localized.
Which I guess maybe that's where the medieval analogy comes in, right? Like he's envisioning a world where it's much more.
It's like almost like a patchwork of different
little communities.
Communities, exactly.
Yeah, that are all kind of doing their own thing.
Right, and each community can kind of structure itself according to its own
values, its own customs,
traditions. Exactly.
Okay.
So you might have a community of very traditional Catholics
who are living in one place, and then you might have a community of, I don't know, like free thinking artists living in another, and they're
not trying to impose their values on each other.
Exactly.
They're just like living and let live.
Right. And the idea is that this kind of decentralization would actually lead to a more stable and harmonious society overall.
It's a fascinating vision, I'll give them that.
Yeah.
But I can't help but wonder about the third group, the lazari.
Right.
That term itself.
It's a very loaded term.
Yeah, it almost feels like a slur.
It is, and it's a term that Yarvin himself acknowledges is potentially problematic.
Okay.
But he uses it to describe what he sees as the deracinated underclass.
The deracinated underclass. Okay.
So these are the people who exist kind of outside the traditional structures of society, often by by choice or by circumstance.
So are we talking about like the chronically unemployed,
Potential.
the dropouts?
Yeah, the people who don't fit into the yeoman ideal, right?
Right.
But Yarvin is very careful to point out that the Lazaris are not inherently bad.
Okay.
Or dysfunctional.
He doesn't see them as like morally bad.
Right. He sees them as possessing a certain, I don't know, like raw energy, vitality that if channeled correctly could actually be a source of renewal and creativity for society.
So he's not saying that they're like a problem to be solved, but they are a group that needs to be like, I don't know, accounted for in his system.
They need to be, integrated or maybe even like harnessed is the word he might use.
Okay.
Because they have this energy that could be destructive,
right,
but it could also be,
if properly channeled, it could be a good thing.
Exactly.
Okay, so how does all of this play out in terms of governance? Because we've talked about these three groups, the armatures, the yeomen, the Lazari, but like who's actually in charge in Yarvin's ideal society, and how does he imagine this nihilist prince figure actually like governing this population?
Right. Well, that's the $1 million question, isn't it?
Yeah.
And he throws out this term nihilist prince, which again is about as provocative as it gets, right?
It conjures up images of like,
some sort of like
leather-clad dictator.
Yeah, stroking a hairless cat.
Yeah, exactly.
While like spaceships are taking off to go,
Right.
colonize Mars or something. You know what I mean?
Yeah, and I think it's important to remember that Yarvin is a master of irony and provocation. So like he's not necessarily advocating for a literal dictator here, I don't think. At least not in the traditional sense.
Right.
It's more nuanced than that.
It's more about like what is the role of leadership in a society that has maybe lost its way.
Okay.
And so this nihilist prince is maybe more of a thought experiment than a blueprint for like an actual political system.
So what is he trying to get us to think about then with this idea of a nihilist prince? Like what are the qualities of this kind of leader that he finds appealing?
Well, I think it has to do with this idea of someone who's willing to take a really long-term view, right? Who's thinking not just about the next election cycle or even the next generation, but like
and the next century.
Centuries, right? Yeah. Someone who's thinking about the long-term health and vitality of the society.
So instead of catering to the whims of the masses,
right, which is what democracy often devolves into.
Right, like bread and circuses.
Exactly.
He's saying we need someone who's guided by a deeper understanding of human nature.
Right, and of what actually leads to a flourishing society.
Okay, so it's not about like imposing their own will on the people. It's more about like understand.
It's almost like a gardener, right? Huh. Who's tending to a garden?
Tending to the different groups within society as if they were plants that need to be, watered and pruned and
given the right amount of sunlight, making sure that the soil is properly fertilized, that kind of thing.
So it's about taking a more holistic view, right? Recognizing that individual freedom, while important, isn't the only factor in creating a good society.
And that sometimes we need
a little bit of, I don't know, constraint,
guidance
to actually like live our best lives, which again, very counterintuitive, right?
Right, because we're so used to thinking of freedom as this unqualified good. What if in our pursuit of individual liberty, we've actually undermined some of the things that make life truly meaningful.
Like community, tradition,
exactly,
purpose, those kinds of things.
Yeah, and those are the things that Yarvin would say the yeomen understand intuitively.
Right.
The armatures, not so much.
And Lazari is just kind of like off in their own little world.
They're trying to figure it out.
Yeah.
But they need the guidance of the wise gardener, I guess.
This is definitely giving me a lot to think about, I have to say.
Yeah.
It's a very different way of looking at the world.
It's challenging.
Yeah.
It's meant to be challenging.
It is. Well, I really appreciate you coming on and walking us through this.
Yeah, of course.
I think this is one of those deep dives where, even if people come away disagreeing with Yarvin, which I think a lot of people probably will.
Sure.
I think it's valuable to at least try to understand where he's coming from.
Absolutely. And to grapple with these ideas, because
Yeah.
even if you reject them, you're at least you've sharpened your own thinking in the process.
Right. You've had to kind of like confront some of your own assumptions.
Exactly.
And I think that's always a valuable exercise.
Absolutely.
Well, on that note, I think we'll leave it there for today.
Sounds good.
Thanks again for joining me.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
And to all our listeners out there, thanks for coming on this wild ride with us.
Yeah, keep those minds open.
And until next time, keep exploring. All right.